Here's a question that I think is worth answering. Should you use raw CSS, or should you write it yourself, or should you use a library, something like Bootstrap, Tailwind? There's probably a lot of others out there too, but those are, I think, the biggest ones that at least I personally know about. Typically, all of my projects that I do, they all use some library of some kind, like Tailwind most recently, or maybe Bootstrap in the past, right? But I recently started working on this new freelancing project for a new client, and they had some work done already. They also have a couple of other developers that I'm actually working with too. It's a bit of a small team. They don't use a library. They don't use Tailwind. They don't use CSS. And like, it's nothing special. It's an e-commerce website. There's not really a lot, or anything for that matter, that's unique about this project. In my opinion, they would greatly benefit from using a library because a lot of it would be standardized, a lot of it would be done for us, we'd be able to move a lot faster, we wouldn't have some of the issues that we are having, at least in my opinion, right? But they're writing everything themselves. And I kind of was wondering, well, why? Like, why would they do that? Why would someone choose to do that beyond maybe just because, oh, that's what I know and that's what I'm comfortable with? Like, what really is there beyond that?
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
I had a law professor in college, and he said, first day of class, if I ask you a question and your answer is not, well, it depends, then you've already gotten it wrong. So with that, it depends.
Depends who's asking.
We are.
Who's we?
Depends who's asking.
Also, I want to differentiate a component library from a CSS library. So when I say a CSS library, I'm talking about something like Bootstrap, Tailwind, like the raw stuff that they give you on their websites that you would then go and just use their CSS classes to actually help style your own project. A component library, on the other hand, would be something like React Strap or React Bootstrap, I think there's also called, or Next UI or something like that. These are things that have taken a library of some kind and they've applied them and created components for the framework that you're using, so that you can actually use them even easier, even quicker. It's a bit more of an abstraction over CSS. When a lot of people complain about potentially having their website or their project look like everything else out there on the internet, they're most likely talking about that, because typically what I find, or have in my experience, a good CSS library does not mean that your project will look like everything else. It's all about how you use it. Whereas a component library is pre-styled to behave and look a certain way. In that case, it will look like everything else. All right, so let's cover a few things that it would depend on, whether or not you should use a library or whether or not you should write your own CSS. Well, the first thing is the project itself. Are you building something that is just a typical web app? Like, actually, I have some examples here, but are you building something that is like a typical website or a typical web app? Or are you building something that is a really, really unique and different experience that doesn't really exist out there like before? You then have to maybe write your own stuff. So let's take a look at some examples here. So the first one I want to show you is React website, right? This is good. It looks good, but there's nothing like really different about this, I wouldn't say. I mean, this is something that a CSS library can 100% handle for you. And as a matter of fact, according to this plugin that I use called Wappalizer, they actually use Tailwind CSS right there. They actually use Tailwind CSS. Here's another example, Next.js, their website. Not anything like overly different though, right? And according to that same Wappalizer plugin, scroll down here, they use Tailwind CSS, right? Now, check these other two out. This one, they do not, this is super unique. I have no idea. This is actually making me kind of dizzy, but I don't really know how you would go about building something like this. Probably a lot of custom JavaScript, and maybe there's like some CSS library here, but it doesn't seem like that much. Right? This is an interesting experience that they've created. Oh, there's music playing. Okay, no, there's no music playing. This is really interesting. And if we come over here to this Wappalizer thing, I don't see any framework here, any CSS libraries mentioned here. So that's this. I mean, looks incredible. I mean, you can tell that they really spent a lot of time putting this together. I'm not really sure what exactly this website's for, but it looks amazing. They, according to that plugin that I was showing you, did not use any CSS library. So that's one example of a very unique experience that perhaps you need to create that you wouldn't be able to use a CSS library for. Here's another one. We're going to get a little dizzy here, but this is about, I think it's this guy's portfolio or something like that. We can go both and we can go up and down here. Again, incredible. I don't want to make anyone dizzy, so I'll kind of go away from those. But pretty incredible what they're able to create, but they weren't able to use a CSS framework. Just to kind of show you, according to this plugin, again, no framework here. Doesn't look like this. The 3JS, that is actually, I think, like an animation library, but it's not a CSS framework. A CSS library is the point I'm trying to make. How do we determine whether or not our project is best for a CSS library or for a custom job, right? Well, how do we figure that one out? Well, let's think about our constraints. A lot of developers will use the word constraints, but beyond constraints, along with that, we also have to consider the risks. Okay, constraints, risks, they go hand in hand, although I don't really hear many developers use the word risks. But let's say, for example, that one of the constraints that we have in a website that we're working on is time. That's the biggest constraint for this website, this hypothetical website. We have to get it done in 1 month. That's not that much time. Now, that's the constraint, time, right? But the risk is that we don't get it done in time. Not that we don't make it look good, because maybe it's just a normal website, right? The risk is that we don't get it done in time. The risk is that we lose the business money. Maybe it's a freelance client. They can't, they aren't able to pay us after 1 month. Or maybe they need to launch in 1 month. Or it's a startup. They need to be able to start delivering value to their users, their customers. Whatever it is, the risk is that if we don't get it done on time, there could be real world business impact. Financial impact, right? That's something that we need to consider. And in that case, when time is the biggest constraint and not getting it done on time is the biggest risk, it makes sense to use a CSS library, because the whole point of CSS libraries are to save you work, save you time, right? That makes sense. But in those examples that I showed you where we were kind of dragging all over the place and moving everywhere, those are interesting, unique experiences. And in that case, let's say we had 6 months, sure, time is still a constraint, but the risk is a little bit lower. In that case, like, those were all about the unique experience that they were going to be able to provide you. And in that case, risk was not providing the user or the viewer with the correct experience that we wanted to be able to provide them with. So it's really just about finding out, what are the constraints we're working with and what are the risks that we're up against. What about the benefits of raw CSS? So I think there's 2 pretty big benefits here for raw CSS. The first is that we have full control. Now, this is kind of a question you have to ask yourself and manage on your own. Do you need full control? Sometimes you might need full control, but you won't always, right? I made a video talking about if you should use Firebase or not, and it really came down, or one of the things came down to the level of control that you needed. Everyone likes to talk about how Firebase is, taking control away from you, and how maybe it's better to run your own servers because then you have more control, but you also have more responsibility in that case. Same thing with CSS. How much control do you actually need? How much responsibility do you want to have to manage on your own? In the case of a CSS library, you're taking on all of the control. That's great, but you're also taking on all of the responsibility. The risk is actually higher that your CSS might not be up to par with really what the needs of the project are. Another benefit of using your own CSS, writing your own CSS, is that CSS, like JavaScript, like anything else really, is an ever-evolving technology. And in the past few years, certainly there have been features that have come out that are modern that allow us to do a lot of amazing things with CSS. The last thing that you should really consider, I think, is your goal, your end goal. What are you trying to achieve? And I think, not to take away from the things from before, the items before, but this one I think is especially important. Because if you are trying to land a job and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, should I or do I really need to learn CSS? Like, the libraries exist, they work really well, I understand how to use them. Do I really need to learn this thing, this CSS thing? If you're trying to land a job, I think you should learn CSS, because CSS, one, is a very, very foundational technology that the web is built on. Employers are going to want to see that you know CSS. If you don't have that from your resume, that's going to be a red flag for them. Now, the reason is because a lot of companies don't use CSS libraries. I've worked for some that don't use CSS libraries. You might think to yourself, well, why wouldn't they do that? But whatever it was, they had their reasons and they chose not to use it. And if you don't know CSS, you're going to be at a disadvantage when trying to apply for a job at those companies. Even the companies that do use CSS libraries, they will be in situations where not every project that you get to work on uses a CSS library. Not only that, but there will be many cases when working on a project that uses one library where you need to write custom CSS code in order to do something that you need to do. I've personally been in both of those cases, right? Or all three of those cases or whatever. I've personally been in those cases before, in those situations. And it was really, really important that I knew CSS. And had I not known CSS, I would have been in trouble. This isn't to say that you need to become like a CSS expert, but you'll definitely want to have a pretty solid understanding of the inner workings and mechanics of CSS and how it works. You basically want to be at the point where you can kind of see a problem and you understand how to utilize CSS or how to go and figure out how to use CSS in order to solve that problem based on a general understanding at a foundational level of how CSS works, I would say. The other goal that you might have is that you want to work on your own project, be it a side project, passion project, or a startup or a business idea that you're trying to work on. In this case, I would say if you're not working on something that needs crazy customized CSS, don't worry about CSS, or at least learn CSS to the point that you understand what the classes that you're using from that library are doing. So for example, if you add a px-4, you should have an understanding of what that is doing on the CSS side, but you don't really need to learn CSS to the point that you're like some expert. Just learn it to the point that you understand what the library is doing for you, and then go and learn the library or whatever you need. Because in that case, the whole point, the biggest thing that you need to do is worry about moving quickly and getting their product or getting your service or getting your project out the door so that you can accomplish whatever your end goal is with that product, be it to just have something cool that you can put on a resume, or maybe it's something, actually, if you want to put something on a resume, you probably want to land a job. So in that case, definitely learn CSS. But in the other case, maybe you just want to have like a side business or you're trying to build like some SaaS product. You probably don't need to learn CSS as much as you do if you want to land a job, because in that case, you're trying to sell a product, right? The whole point is that you just iterate as quickly as possible. All right, thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully this was beneficial and helpful to you. If you did like it, definitely subscribe, rate, and comment. I will see you all in the next video.